Hi, I'm Tassos, and this should have been the UX UI review series. While searching for modern games and RPGs in particular to create a new review, I decided to do Final Fantasy XV, the last entry of a franchise I love. But before we get into that, I thought it was more appropriate to first go back deep into the origins of the Japanese RPG and study how the innovations of this subgenre shaped video games during the past decades. Many notable games have contributed to the medium, evolving it with new features and were trendsetters for games that are considered successful today. There was a radical departure from the classical RPG lore that was derived from Dungeons & Dragons to diverse science fiction settings. This had as a result an introduction of more diverse UI elements and a freedom in their design, structure and implementation. They established conventions such as epic, dramatic, character-driven storylines, which was a paradigm shift for the current user experience. While the Japanese video game industry has long been viewed as console-centric in the Western world, due to the worldwide success of Japanese consoles beginning with the NES, the country had in fact produced thousands of commercial personal computer games from the late 70s up until the mid-90s. The market eventually became dominated by the NEC PC8801 and PC9801, though with some competition from the Sharp X1 and X68000, FM7 and FM Towns, and MSX and MSX2. A key difference between Western and Japanese systems at the time was the latter's higher display resolutions, 64 pixels wide and 400 pixels high, in order to accommodate Japanese text, which in turn influenced game design. Japanese computers also employed Yamaha FM synthesis soundboards since the early 80s, allowing video game music composers such as Yuzo Koshiro to produce highly regarded chiptune music for RPG companies such as Nihon Falcom. Due to hardware differences, only a small portion of Japanese computer games were released in North America as ports to either consoles, like the NES or Genesis, or American PC platforms, like MS-DOS. The Wizardry series, translated by ASCII Entertainment in Japanese, became popular and influential in Japan, even more so than in the United States. Early Japanese RPGs were also influenced by visual novel adventure games, which were developed by companies such as Enix, Squaresoft, Nihon Falcom and Koei before they moved on to developing RPGs. During this early period, Japanese developers produced a diverse array of creative, experimental computer RPGs prior to mainstream titles such as Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy eventually cementing genre tropes. Looking back to the 80s, Japan's earliest RPGs were released in 1982. The first was Koei's Underground Exploration, released in March 1982. It was followed by Pony Canyon's Spy Daisakusen, released in April of the same year. Based on the Mission Impossible franchise, it replaced the traditional fantasy setting with a modern espionage one. In 1982, Dragon and the Princess was released by Koei, which was a text-based RPG among many others, but it had a distinct feature. The enemy battles had a graphical tactical turn-based system, a first for games on this era. In 1983, Bokosuka Wars by ASCII Entertainment was a simulation RPG as it is known in Japan, with its blend of role-playing and strategy video game elements. The game revolved around a leader who must lead his army against overwhelming enemy forces while recruiting soldiers along the way, and with each unit able to gain experience and level up through battle. The game was also considered to be an early example of a real-time action RPG. Another important title released that same year was Koei's Nobunaga's Ambition for Japanese computers. It was an early attempt at combining role-playing, turn-based grand strategy and management simulation elements, setting the standard for future simulation RPGs. The next year, one of the first games to use a visual health meter was Namco's 1984 video game Dragon Buster. The health meter was called Vitality, and it was one of the first graphical representations of health as a bar, with the health points regenerating by a percentage after finishing a stage. The trend of combining role-playing elements with arcade-style action mechanics was popularized by the Tower of Druaga, an arcade game released by Namco in June 1984. While the RPG elements in Druaga were very subtle, its success in Japan inspired the near-simultaneous development of 3 early action role-playing games, combining Druaga's real-time hack-and-slash gameplay with stronger RPG mechanics, all released in late 1984. Dragon Slayer, Courageous Perseus and Hydlide. A rivalry developed between the 3 games, with Dragon Slayer and Hydlide continuing their rivalry through subsequent sequels. Dragon Slayer, released by Nihon Falcom, laid the foundations for the Japanese role-playing game industry. It was a real-time hack-and-slash dungeon crawler that is considered the first action role-playing game, alongside the Tower of Druaga. Dragon Slayer was a major success in Japan and led to the emergence of a distinct action role-playing game subgenre on Japanese computers. Hydlide, an action RPG released for the PC 8801 in 1984 and the NES in 1986, was an early open-world game, rewarding exploration in an open-world environment. It also added several innovations to the action RPG subgenre, including the ability to switch between attack and defense mode, quick save and load options which could be done at any moment of the game through the use of passwords as a primary backup, and the introduction of a health regeneration mechanic, where health and magic slowly regenerate when standing still. A feature also used in Falcom's YS series from 1987 and onwards. Also, in 1984, the Black Onyx, developed by Bulletproof Software, led by Hank Rogers, was released on the PC 8801 in Japan. It became one of the best-selling computer games at the time and was voted Game of the Year by Logan, the largest Japanese computer game magazine at the time. Dragon Slayer's success led to the 1985 sequel Dragon Slayer 2 Xanadu, which became the best-selling PC game in Japan. It was a full-fledged RPG with character stats and a large quest with action-based combat, setting it apart from other RPGs. It included both melee combat and projectile magic attacks, while incorporating a side-scrolling platform game view during exploration and an overhead view during battle. Xanadu also featured innovative gameplay mechanics, such as individual experience for equipped items, and an early karma morality system where the player character's karma meter would rise if he committed sin, which in turn affected the temple's reaction to him. It is also considered a proto-Metroidvania game due to being an RPG turn on its side that allowed players to run, jump, collect and explore. The way the Dragon Slayer series reworked the entire game system of each installment was an influence on Final Fantasy, which would do the same for each of its installments. According to game's trademark and John Sepaniak of Retro Gamer and The Escapist, Enix's Dragon Quest was also influenced by Dragon Slayer and in turn defined many other RPGs. Falcom was becoming one of the 3 most important Japanese role-playing game developers in the 80s, alongside Enix and Square, both of which were influenced by Falcom. In 1985, Hydlide 2 Shine of Darkness was released, featuring also an early morality meter, where the player could be aligned with justice, normal or evil, which was affected by whether the player killed evil monsters, good monsters or humans, and in turn affected the reactions of the townsfolk towards the player. This system, together with the karma in Dragon Slayer 2, laid the groundwork for future RPGs to come, with BioWare's Mass Effect and Dragon Age series being loved for using this mechanic. Yuji Horii and his team at Chunsoft began production of Dragon Quest, or as it was known then, Dragon Warrior, in 1985. After Enix published the game in early '86, it became the template for future console RPGs. The game was influenced by the first-person random battles in Wizardry, the overhead movement in Ultima, and the mystery storytelling in Horii's own 1983 visual novel game, Portopia Serial Murder Case. Horii's intention behind Dragon Quest was to create an RPG that appeals to a wider audience unfamiliar with the genre or video games in general. Compared to statistics-heavy computer RPGs, Dragon Quest was a more streamlined, faster-paced game based on exploration and combat, and featured a top-down view in dungeons. The game also placed a greater emphasis on storytelling and emotional involvement, introducing a coming-of-age tale that audiences could relate to. It also featured elements still found in most console RPGs, like major quests interwoven with minor subquests, an incremental spell system, the damsel in distress storyline that many RPGs follow, and a romance element that remains a staple of the genre, alongside anime-style art by Akira Toriyama, of the Dragon Ball fame among others, and a classical score by Koichi Sugiyama that was considered revolutionary for console video game music. The gameplay of Dragon Quest itself was non-linear, with most of the game not blocked in any way other than by being infested with monsters that could easily kill an unprepared player. This was balanced by the use of bridges to signify a change in difficulty, and a new level progression that departed from D&D, where in the first and second editions players are given random initial stats. Dragon Quest instead gave the player some extra hit points at the start and a level progression where the effective rate of character growth decelerates over time, similar to how the more recent editions of D&D have balanced the gameplay. Dragon Quest also gave players a clear objective from the start of the game and a series of smaller scenarios to build up the player's strength in order to achieve that objective. The ending could also be altered depending on the moral dialogue choice of whether or not the protagonist should join the antagonist on his evil conquest towards the end of the game. The inventory was limited, requiring item management, while the caves were dark, requiring the use of a torch to display a field of vision around the character. Dragon Quest did not reach North America until 1989, when it was released as Dragon Warrior. Leaving 1985 behind, 1986 saw the arcade release of the sequel to the Tower of Druaga, The Return of Ishtar, an early action RPG to feature two-player cooperative gameplay, dual-stick control in single player, a female protagonist, the first heroic couple in gaming, and the first password safe system. A notable Japanese computer RPG from around this time was WiBArm, the earliest known RPG to feature 3D polygonal graphics. It was a 1986 role-playing shooter released by Arsys software for the PC-88 in Japan and ported to MS-DOS for Western release by Broderbund. In WiBArm, the player controlled a transformable mecha robot, switching between a 2D side-scrolling view during auto-exploration to a fully 3D polygonal third-person perspective inside buildings. Bosses were fought in an arena-style 2D shoot-'em-up battle. The game featured a variety of weapons and equipment as well as an auto map, and the player could upgrade equipment and earn experience to raise stats. Unlike first-person RPGs at the time that were restricted to 90-degree movements, WiBArm's use of 3D polygons allowed full 360-degree movement. Other releases at the time were the action role-playing games Deadly Towers in 1986 and Druaga in 1987. These games were notable as some of the first Japanese console RPGs to be released in North America, where they were well received for being a new kind of RPG that differed from both the console action adventures, such as Castlevania, Trojan, and Wizards and Warriors, and American computer RPGs such as Wizardry, Ultima, and Might and Magic, that gamers were previously more familiar with at the time. Deadly Towers and Druaga were particularly notable for the permanent power-up mechanics. The fifth Dragon Slayer title, Sorcerian, was also released in 1987. It was a party-based action RPG, with the player controlling a party of 4 characters at the same time in a side-scrolling view. The game also featured character creation, highly customizable characters, class-based puzzles, and a new scenario system, allowing players to choose which of 15 scenarios or quests to play through in the order of their choice. And at last we arrive at Squaresoft's original Final Fantasy for the NES. It introduced an experimental character creation system that allowed the players to create their own parties and assign different character classes to party members, who in turn evolved through an early class change system later in the game. It also featured unique concepts such as time travel, side view battles with the player characters on the right and the enemies on the left, which soon became the norm for numerous console RPGs, and the use of transportation for travel by ship, canoe, and even flying airship. While creating Final Fantasy, Hironobu Sakaguchi took inspiration from certain elements in Hayao Miyazaki's anime films, such as the airships being inspired by Castle in the Sky. Also released in 1987, digital devil story Megami Tensei by Atlus for the NES abandoned the common medieval fantasy setting and sword and sorcery theme in favor for a modern science fiction setting and horror theme. It introduced the monster catching mechanic with its demon summoning system, which allowed the player to recruit enemies into their party through a conversation system that gave the player a choice of whether to kill or spare an enemy and allowed them to engage any opponent in conversation. In the same year, Miracle Warriors Seal of the Dark Lord was a third-person RPG that featured a distinct UI element, although primitive. There was a minimap on the upper right corner of the screen. The Magic of Scheherazade, also released in 1987, was notable for several innovations, including a unique setting based on the Arabian Nights, time travel between 5 different time periods, a unique combat system featuring both real-time solo action and turn-based team battles, and the introduction of team attacks where 2 party members could join forces to perform an extra powerful attack. In 1987 again, Castlevania II Simon's Quest was an action RPG that combined the platform action mechanics of the original Castlevania, but with the open world of an action-adventure and RPG mechanics such as experience points. It also introduced a day-night cycle that affected when certain NPCs appear in certain locations. The game offered 3 possible different endings depending on the time it took to complete the game. In this year, Falcom released the first installment of its popular long-running YS series. Besides Falcom's own Dragon Slayer series, YS was also influenced by Hydlide, from which it borrowed certain mechanics such as health regeneration when standing still, a mechanic that has since become common in video games today. YS was also a precursor to RPGs that emphasize storytelling, and it is known for its bump attack system, where the protagonist automatically attacks when running into enemies off-center, making the game more accessible and the usually tedious level grinding task more swift and enjoyable. The game also had what is considered to be one of the best and most influential video game music soundtracks of all time, composed by Yuzo Koshiro and Mieko Ishikawa. In terms of the number of game releases, YS is second only to Final Fantasy as the largest Eastern role-playing game franchise. Hydlide 3 The Space Memories was released for the MSX in 1987, and for the Mega Drive as Super Hydlide in 1989. It adopted the morality meter of its predecessor, expanding on its time option with the introduction of an in-game clock setting, day-night cycles, and a need to sleep and eat. It also made other improvements such as cutscenes for the opening and ending, a combat system closer to The Legend of Zelda, the choice between 4 distinct character classes, a wider variety of equipment and spells, and a weight system affecting the player's movement depending on the overall weight of the equipment carried. Lastly, in 1987, SEGA's original Phantasy Star for the Master System established a number of genre conventions, with its strong plot that involved a quest for revenge and corruption by power, a sci-fi and fantasy setting that set it apart from the D&D stable too. Also, there were individual spells that required magic points. An important innovation that would later become common in role-playing games was the use of predefined player characters with their own backstories. It was also one of the first games to feature animated monster encounters on a console and allowed interplanetary travel between 3 planets. Boys Life magazine in 1988 predicted that Phantasy Star, as well as the Zelda games, may represent the future of home video games, combining the qualities of both arcade and computer games. Some of these 1987 releases proved popular and went on to spawn their own RPG franchises, particularly the Megami Tensei, Phantasy Star and Final Fantasy series. In particular, the Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest series remain popular today, Final Fantasy more so in the West and Dragon Quest in Japan. Jumping to 1988, Dragon Quest III introduced a character progression system, allowing the player to change the party's character classes during the course of the game, and keep a character's stats and skills learned from previous classes. This class-changing system shaped the gameplay of future RPGs like the Final Fantasy series. A similar class-changing system later also appeared in Wizardry 6 and 7. It was the most substantial examples of open-world gameplay among the early Dragon Quest games. It also allowed the player to swap characters in and out of the party at will, and another major innovation was the introduction of day-night cycles. Certain items, characters and quests were only accessible at certain times of the day. Final Fantasy II is considered the first true Final Fantasy game, introducing an emotional storyline, morally ambiguous characters, tragic events, and a story to be emotionally experienced rather than concluded from gameplay and conversations. It also replaced traditional levels and experience points with a new activity-based progression system, where the more you use a skill, the better you become. A mechanic that has been used in a number of later RPGs such as the Saga and Grandia series, world's favorite Final Fantasy XIV MMO, and Western RPGs such as the Elder Scrolls series. Final Fantasy II also featured open-ended exploration and introduced an innovative dialogue system where keywords or phrases can be memorized and mentioned during conversation with NPCs. Its story, the theme of an evil empire against a small band of rebels, was similar to Star Wars, and the iconic Chocobo, a now popular fictional creature used for traveling, was inspired by Hayao Miyazaki's Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind. This year also saw the release of Arsys Software's Star Cruiser, an innovative action RPG released for the PC 8801. It was notable for being an early example of an RPG with fully 3D polygonal graphics combined with first-person shooter gameplay, which would occasionally switch to spaceflight simulator gameplay when exploring outer space with 6 degrees of freedom. All the backgrounds, objects and opponents in the game were rendered in 3D polygons, many years before they were widely adopted by the video game industry. The game also emphasized storytelling, with plot twists and extensive character dialogue, taking place in a futuristic science fiction setting. It won the 1988 Game of the Year awards from the Japanese computer game magazines Popcom and OX. Star Cruiser was later ported to the Mega Drive console in 1990. Also that same year, War of the Dead Part 2 for the MSX2 and PC-88 abandoned certain RPG elements of its predecessor, such as random encounters, and instead adopted more action-adventure elements from Metal Gear, while retaining its horror atmosphere. 1988 also saw the debut of Telenet Japan's Exile, a series of action platform RPGs, beginning with XZR Idols of Apostate. The series was controversial for its plot, which revolved around a time-traveling Crusades-era Syrian Islamic assassin who assassinates various religious historical figures, as well as modern-day political leaders, with similarities to the present-day Assassin's Creed action game series. In 1989, Phantasy Star 2 for the Sega Genesis, aka the Mega Drive, established many conventions of the genre, including a storyline dealing with serious themes and subject matter, and a strategy-based battle system. The game's science fiction story was also unique, reversing the common alien invasion scenario by instead presenting Earthlings as the invading antagonists. The game's strong characterization and use of self-discovery as a motivating factor for the characters and the player was a major departure from previous RPGs and had a major influence on subsequent games such as the Final Fantasy series. Capcom's Sweet Home for the NES introduced a modern Japanese horror theme and laid the foundations for the survival horror genre, later serving as the main inspiration for Resident Evil. Like Resident Evil, Sweet Home featured the use of scattered notes as a storytelling mechanic and a number of multiple endings, depending on which characters survived to the end. Tengai Makio Ziria, released for the PC Engine CD, that same year was the first RPG released on CD-ROM, and the first in the genre to feature animated cutscenes and voice acting. The game's plot was also unusual for its feudal Japan setting, and its emphasis on humor. The plot and characters were inspired by the Japanese folk tale Jiraiya Goketsu Monogatari. The music for the game was also composed by noted musician Ryuichi Sakamoto. Also in 1989, the early enhanced remake of YSN2 was one of the first games to use CD-ROM, utilized to provide enhanced graphics, animated cutscenes, a CD soundtrack and voice acting. The game offered a much larger, more colorful world, populated with lifelike characters who communicated with voice instead of text, heralding the evolution of the standard role-playing game according to RPG Fan. Its English localization was also one of the first to use voice dubbing. YS2 introduced the unique ability to transform into a monster, which allowed the player to both scare human non-player characters for unique dialogue, as well as interact with all the monsters. This is a recurring highlight in the series, offering the player insight into the enemies to an extent that very few other games allow to this day. I can only think of Nier using a similar mechanic on subsequent playthroughs where you could understand the dialogue of the monsters you killed, but the main character could not. This made you sympathetic and kinda reluctant to go on killing them. YS1 and 2 went on to receive the Game of the Year award from Omni magazine in 1990, as well as many other prizes. 1989 also saw the release of Dungeon Explorer, developed by Atlus for the TurboGrafx-16, which is considered a pioneer title in the action RPG genre with its multiplayer cooperative gameplay, allowing up to 5 players to play simultaneously. Final Fantasy Legend for the Game Boy, the first in the Saga series, adopted Final Fantasy II's activity-based progression, expanding it with weapons that shatter with repeated use, and added new ideas, such as a race of monsters that mutate depending on which fallen foes they consume. The game also introduced the concept of memento mori, with the theme revolving around death, while the plot consisted of loosely connected stories and side quests, rather than an epic narrative. That same year, River City Ransom featured elements of both the beat-em-up and action RPG genres, combining brawler combat with many RPG elements, including an inventory, buying and selling items, learning new abilities and skills, needing to listen for clues, searching to find all the bosses, shopping in the malls, buying items to heal and increasing stats. It is considered as an early sandbox brawler reminiscent of Grand Theft Auto. Crossing the time to the next decade, the Japanese computer game industry began declining, apart from a few marvels released in the early 90s. In 1990, Data East's Gate of Doom was an arcade action RPG that combined beat-em-up fighting gameplay with fantasy role-playing and introduced an isometric perspective. That same year, Enix released a unique biological simulation action RPG by Almanac that revolved around the theme of evolution, 46 Okunen Monogatari, a revised version of which was released in 1992 as E.V.O, Search for Eden. Alpha Denshi's Cross Swords combined the first-person beat-em-up gameplay of SNK's The Super Spy with RPG elements, while replacing the first-person shooting with hack-and-slash combat. Also in 1990, Hideo Kojima's Snatcher, while turn-based, abandoned random encounters and introduced an innovative first-person shooter-based battle system, where firearm weapons, each with different abilities and target ranges, have limited ammunition and the player can aim at specific parts of the enemy's body, with each part weakening the enemy in different ways. Such a battle system has rarely been used since, though similar battle systems based on targeting individual body parts can later be found in Square's Shakespearean masterpiece Vagrant Story, released in 2000, Bethesda's Fallout 3 in 2008, and Nipponichi's Last Rebellion in 2010. In 1991, Nihon Falcom's Brandish was an early overhead action RPG to use mouse controls, where the player could move forward, backward, turn, strafe and attack by clicking on boxes surrounding the player character. The 1991 Dragon Slayer title Lord Monarch departed from the action RPG gameplay of its predecessors, instead using an early form of real-time strategy gameplay. That same year, Arcus Odyssey by Wolf Team, now Namco Tales Studio, was an action RPG that featured an isometric perspective and cooperative multiplayer gameplay. The Japanese computer game industry decline was partly due to the death of the NEC PC 9801 computer format, as the Sega Saturn and Sony PlayStation became increasingly powerful in the console market, while the computer market became increasingly dominated by the IBM personal computer and Microsoft Windows 95. This led to many Japanese PC manufacturers either continuing to develop for Windows 95 or moving over to the more lucrative console market. While most developers turned their attention to the console market, some of them that were dedicated to content unsuitable for consoles, such as rogue and complex military strategy games, continued their focus on the PC market. And thus concludes the not-so-brief after all first part. The Japanese RPG during the 80s was something like a testbed to try and draw more and more people from other genres or the ones that didn't play at all into them, and to try out different combinations of new mechanics, UIs and storylines. It was a really exciting time for everyone discovering video games and getting immersed into their unique worlds. If you enjoyed this, please like and subscribe, and click on the little bell icon to get notifications on when the second part of it or any of my videos will be up. In the next one, we will witness the innovations of JRPGs from the 90s, the golden era of the console Japanese role-playing game.